The hall went silent the moment Kale lifted his hand. Lyra stood before him, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole pack could hear it. Torches burned along the stone walls of the Nightshade Hall, throwing shifting light across hundreds of watching faces. She had waited 3 years for this bond to mean something. Now, in front of everyone she knew, it was about to be erased. "Say it," whispered Edmund, the eldest of the council, standing just behind the king's shoulder. "Say the words, Kale. The pack is watching. They need to see strength today, not hesitation." Kale's blind eyes, pale as frost, did not move toward Edmund. They stayed fixed somewhere near Lyra, though he could not see her face, could not see the way her hands trembled at her sides, could not see the tears she refused to let fall. "Lyra of the Southern Hollow," Kale said, his voice steady, despite the storm clearly running beneath it. "I release you from the bond between us." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a woman covered her mouth. Lyra felt the words strike her chest like a physical blow, and for a moment, the world tilted sideways. The bond, the invisible thread that had connected her to this man since the night the moon marked them both, snapped taut, then loosened, then went terribly, permanently quiet. "You are free of any claim to the Nightshade throne," Kale continued, forcing each word out like stones dragged over gravel. "You are free of any claim to me." Lyra wanted to scream. She wanted to ask him why, to demand he look at her, even though he could not, to beg him to take the words back, before the pack's magic could seal them into truth. But pride kept her spine straight, and her chin lifted, even as everything inside her cracked open. "Understood," she said. Her voice barely shook. She was proud of that. Later, when she thought back on it. In the moment, though, all she felt was the floor dropping away beneath her feet. Edmund exhaled in obvious relief. Beside him, another advisor named Nathaniel nodded once, satisfied, as though a difficult piece of business had finally been settled. To them, this was simple math. A king who could not see, could not be seen as strong by rival packs, and a king bonded to an ordinary Omega with no political weight was, in their eyes, doubly weak. Removing the bond was supposed to remove the perception of weakness. Nobody in that hall asked Kale if he wanted this. Nobody asked Lyra how it would feel to walk out those doors with nothing. The ceremony ended quickly after that. There were no more words needed. Bonds within the pack were broken all the time for practical reasons, and the pack's magic did not require lengthy rituals, only truthful intent behind the words spoken and witnessed. The moment Kale finished speaking, Lyra felt something inside her chest go cold, like a candle pinched out between 2 fingers. She turned and walked out of the hall without looking back. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean, a welcome contrast to the suffocating heat of the torches and the crowd. Lyra did not cry until she reached the edge of the training yard, far enough from the hall that no one would see her. Then she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and let herself slide down until she was sitting on the frozen ground, her knees pulled to her chest. She thought about the first time she met Kale, 2 years before he became king, back when his eyes still worked, and he used to laugh loudly at things that were not even that funny. She thought about the night the moon bond activated between them, how warm his hand had felt closing around hers, how certain she had been that whatever happened next in her life, it would happen beside him. She thought about the accident that took his sight, 8 months ago, during a border skirmish with a rival pack led by a wolf named Daniel. She remembered sitting beside his bed for 3 days afterward, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, until the healers physically pulled her away so she would not collapse from exhaustion herself. She thought about how, in the months since then, Kale had grown distant, quiet, wrapped in something she now understood must have been the council's constant pressure. She wished she had noticed sooner. She wished she had fought harder before it reached this point. None of that mattered now. The bond was gone. Whatever Kale felt underneath his careful, formal words in that hall, it no longer had any legal or spiritual weight. She was simply Lyra now, no pack, no title, no place. A hand touched her shoulder gently, and she flinched, looking up to see Sable, one of the few people in the pack she still trusted, crouched beside her with a worried expression. "You cannot stay here tonight," Sable said quietly. "Word travels fast. Some of the pack will treat you differently now, and not kindly. You should go before morning." "Go where?" Lyra asked, her voice hollow. "Anywhere but here," Sable said. "I have a cousin near the eastern border. in a town outside pack territory entirely. Neutral ground. Humans and shifted folk both live there without trouble. You could start over. Lyra closed her eyes. Starting over sounded impossible, but staying felt worse. She nodded slowly, and Sable helped her to her feet. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Lyra had already packed a small bag with the few things she owned that mattered. A cloak, a knife for the road, a pouch of coins Sable had pressed into her hands despite her protests. She did not say goodbye to anyone else. There was no one else she wanted to see. As she passed the outer gate of Nightshade territory, she paused only once, looking back at the towering shape of the King's Hall, silhouetted against the fading stars. Somewhere inside, Kale was probably still standing exactly where she left him, blind and burdened by a crown that had cost him everything that made it worth wearing. She turned away and did not look back again. The road east was long and mostly empty. Lyra walked through 2 full days without seeing another soul, surviving on the dried food Sable had packed, and water from the streams that crossed her path. On the 3rd day, she reached a wide river, marking the boundary of packlands, and beyond it, the beginning of a land where wolves and humans lived side by side, without titles or bonds, or councils deciding their fates. The town on the other side was called Ashwell, a modest collection of stone houses and wooden shops built along a slow curve of the river. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children ran between market stalls. Nobody here knew her name, and nobody here cared what pack she came from. She found Sable's cousin easily enough, a kind older woman named Margaret, who ran a small apothecary shop near the town square. Margaret took one look at Lyra's exhausted face and travel-worn clothes, and did not ask a single question, before pulling her inside and putting a bowl of warm soup in front of her. "You can stay in the room above the shop," Margaret said simply. "It has been empty since my daughter married and moved north. You will work here, learning the trade, and in exchange you will have a roof and a bed. That is the arrangement. Nothing more needs to be said about where you came from, unless you wish to say it." Lyra nearly wept at the kindness of it, offered so plainly, without pity or condition. She accepted immediately. Over the following weeks, she threw herself into learning everything Margaret could teach her about herbs and remedies. It gave her hands something to do, and her mind something to focus on, besides the ache that still lived somewhere behind her ribs. She learned which roots eased fever, which leaves calmed a racing heart, which flowers, when dried properly, could ease the kind of pain that lived deeper than the body. One afternoon, while helping Margaret sort through a delivery of rare seeds from a traveling merchant, Lyra noticed a small cloth pouch tucked at the bottom of the crate, forgotten or perhaps deliberately left behind. Inside were pale silver seeds unlike anything she had seen before. "Moonflower," Margaret said, examining them with obvious interest. "Rare thing. Grows only for certain people, or so the old stories claim. Said to bloom fully only under a very particular kind of person. Someone strong enough to survive losing everything, and still choose to grow something beautiful from it." Lyra turned one of the seeds over in her palm, feeling an unexpected pull toward it, as though the tiny thing recognized something in her that she had not yet recognized in herself. "I would like to try planting them," she said quietly. Margaret smiled, a knowing sort of smile that suggested she understood more than she let on. "Then you shall. There is a small plot behind the shop that gets good moonlight in the evenings. It has been unused for years. Perhaps it was simply waiting for you." That evening, Lyra knelt in the soft earth behind the apothecary and planted the first of the moonflower seeds with her own hands, pressing the soil gently over each one, whispering nothing in particular to them, except a quiet hope that something good might still grow from all the loss she carried. She did not know, kneeling there in the fading light with dirt beneath her fingernails and the last traces of a broken bond still aching faintly in her chest, that the scent those flowers would eventually produce would one day travel farther than she could imagine, carried on a trade wind directly toward the one person in the world who would recognize it instantly, even without ever being able to see it bloom. For now, she only knew the simple relief of dirt under her hands, and a task ahead of her that had nothing to do with kings or councils or bonds, broken in front of a watching crowd. For the first time, since that terrible night in the Nightshade Hall, Lyra allowed herself to breathe fully, and to imagine, however faintly, a future that belonged entirely to her. 5 years would pass before that future collided, without warning. With the past, she thought she had left behind for good. The bell above the apothecary door rang sharply, and Lyra looked up from the counter just in time to catch a jar of dried lavender before it tipped over the edge. "Careful," she called out to the pair of children who had just burst inside, laughing and chasing each other between the shelves. "Break something in here, and you will be pulling weeds in my garden for a month to pay for it." The children slowed immediately, grinning sheepishly, and Lyra could not help but smile back. 5 years in Ashwell had changed her, in ways she rarely noticed until moments like this one, when she caught herself sounding exactly like the confident, settled woman she had once been afraid she would never become again. The apothecary was hers now, fully. Margaret had passed the shop to her formally 2 years earlier, choosing to retire to her daughter's home in the north, content that the business she had built was in capable hands. Lyra had expanded the shop since then, adding new shelves, new remedies, and a small back room where she saw patients privately for more delicate matters. But it was the garden behind the shop that people in Ashwell had truly come to know her for. The moonflowers had thrived beyond anything she or Margaret could have predicted. What began as a single small plot of pale silver seeds had grown, year after year, into a wide and thriving garden, rows of tall stems topped with delicate white and silver blossoms that only opened fully after sunset, releasing a scent unlike anything else grown in the region. Some described it as sweet, like starlight given a smell. Others called it calming, saying a single evening spent near the blooming garden could ease even the worst restlessness. Word of the garden had traveled slowly outward from Ashwell over the years, first to nearby villages, then to trading posts along the river, and eventually, though Lyra rarely thought about it, into the wider trade routes that connected the neutral lands to the packed territories beyond. She had made peace, mostly, with the life she now lived. The ache from that night in the Nightshade Hall had dulled into something more like an old scar than an open wound, still present, still occasionally tender when pressed, but no longer capable of stopping her breath the way it once had. She had built a life here, a real one, and she rarely allowed herself to think about Cale, or the throne he now sat upon somewhere far to the west, or the bond that had once tied her fate so tightly to his own. "Lyra," called a familiar voice from the back doorway, and she turned to see Grace, a young woman who had become both her closest friend and her most trusted assistant in the shop, standing with a basket of freshly cut herbs balanced on her hip. "The evening market starts in an hour. Are you bringing the lavender oil, or only the usual healing salves?" "Both," Lyra said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And box up a dozen of the small moonflower bundles too. That trader from the western routes asked for them again last time, said his customers cannot get enough of the scent." Grace raised an eyebrow, setting the basket down on the counter. "Which trader? The tall one with the scar on his hand, or the older man who always haggles for an hour over prices he could easily afford?" "The older one," Lyra said, smiling despite herself. "Henry. He says the moonflowers sell especially well among certain buyers along the pack borders. Something about the scent being considered lucky, or rare enough to be worth the extra coin." "Lucky," Grace repeated thoughtfully, tying a ribbon around one of the small bundles. "I suppose that is one word for it. I still think there is something almost magical about that garden of yours. No other moonflowers in the region bloom the way yours do." Lyra did not answer right away. She had wondered about that herself more than once, remembering the old story Margaret had told her the very first day, about the flower blooming fully, only for a person strong enough to grow something beautiful out of profound loss. She had never fully believed the old tale, but there were nights, standing alone in the garden after the shop closed, breathing in that pale, sweet scent beneath a full moon, when she felt something stir faintly in her chest, something that felt almost like the ghost of a bond long since severed, and she wondered if perhaps the old stories carried more truth than she wanted to admit. She pushed the thought away, as she always did, and focused instead on the practical business of preparing for the evening market. By the time she and Grace arrived at the town square, the market was already filling with the usual crowd of local farmers, traveling merchants, and townsfolk, browsing the stalls before the sun disappeared completely behind the western hills. Lyra set up her small table near the edge of the square, arranging jars of salve and small bundles of dried herbs with the practiced efficiency of 5 years' experience. Henry arrived precisely when she expected him, his cart loaded with goods, bound for the pack territories along the western trade road. He greeted her warmly, as he always did, and after the usual round of good-natured haggling over prices, he purchased his dozen bundles of Moonflower, along with a healthy supply of her other remedies. "These will not last long once we reach Nightshade Markets," Henry said, tucking the bundles carefully into a padded compartment in his cart. "Folk out that way pay well for anything unusual, and your Moonflowers are unusual indeed." Lyra felt a small jolt at the mention of Nightshade, an old reflex she had never quite managed to train out of herself, but she kept her expression calm. "Just be sure you keep them dry," she said instead, focusing on practical matters rather than the uncomfortable flutter in her chest. "The scent fades quickly if they are exposed to too much damp air." Henry assured her he would take proper care, thanked her for her continued business, and moved his cart along toward the next stall, whistling a cheerful tune as he went. Lyra watched him go, telling herself firmly that there was no reason to feel uneasy. Nightshade territory was vast, and Henry's trade route would only skirt its outer borders, nowhere near the King's Hall itself. The chances that anything from her garden would ever come anywhere close to the man who had once, so long ago now, broken a bond between them in front of an entire watching pack, were impossibly small. She had no way of knowing, arranging her jars of salve as the evening market wound down around her, that impossibly small chances had a way of finding their path regardless, especially when a bond, even a broken one, still carried threads too fine to fully cut. That night, after closing the shop and walking the familiar path out to her garden, Lyra knelt among the moonflowers as she often did, breathing in their quiet, pale scent beneath a rising moon. She thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that something grown from loss could smell so much like hope. She did not think about Cale that night, not directly. But somewhere, deep beneath the careful walls she had built around that particular memory, a small and persistent part of her still wondered, whenever the wind carried the scent of her garden outward toward the western road, whether it might travel far enough to reach someone who once knew exactly what it meant to lose everything, and still, somehow, find a reason to keep going. She could not have known how soon she would have her answer. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the Nightshade Council chamber, and every advisor in the room fell silent. Cale stood at the head of the long stone table, his hand still curled into a fist from where he had swept a decanter of wine off its stand. He could not see the shards scattering across the floor, but he heard them clearly enough, and for once, he did not regret the outburst. "Tell me again," he said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that made even Edmund shift uncomfortably in his seat, "how a border patrol of 12 wolves lost an entire supply convoy to Daniel's pack, without a single warning reaching us in time." Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the scouting reports were delayed. The eastern trails have been difficult to monitor since the flooding last season, and without your ability to personally—" He stopped himself too late. "Without my ability to see," Cale finished flatly. "Say it plainly, Nathaniel. You have all been dancing around it for 5 years. My blindness is the reason our scouting has weakened. My blindness is the reason Daniel's pack grows bolder every season, while ours grows thinner. Say it." No one in the chamber spoke. The silence stretched long enough that Cale could hear the faint crackle of the torches lining the walls, and beneath that, the quiet, nervous breathing of men who had spent 5 years building their careers around managing a king they privately believed incapable of ruling, without their constant guidance. It had not always been this way. In the early days after the accident, Cale had fought hard against the growing sense that his blindness made him less capable. He had trained relentlessly, learning to fight by sound and scent and instinct alone, refusing to let his condition define the limits of what he could do. For a while, it had even seemed to work. The pack had rallied around him during the difficult first year, impressed by his determination. But somewhere along the way, exhaustion had worn him down. The constant effort of proving himself capable, day after day, year after year, without a single moment of rest, had slowly eroded the fire that once drove him. He had let the council take on more responsibility than he should have. He had let Edmund and Nathaniel and the others convince him, piece by piece, that certain decisions were better left to those who could see the maps, read the reports, judge the room. And somewhere in that slow surrender, he had also let them convince him to release the one bond that had ever made him feel steady, despite everything else falling apart around him. He thought about Lyra more often than he let anyone know. In quiet moments, late at night, when the halls were empty and the weight of the crown felt unbearable, He found himself remembering the particular way her laughter used to fill a room, the steadiness of her hand in his, during the darkest days after the accident, the quiet strength she carried, even when everyone else assumed a blind alpha's mate must be somehow lesser for standing beside him. He had let his advisors convince him that releasing her would strengthen the pack's perception of his rule. 5 years later, watching that same pack grow weaker, under increasingly frequent raids from Daniel's territory, Cale was no longer certain the advice had been sound. If anything, the pack seemed to have grown more uncertain of him since the bond's release, not less, as though the wolves sensed, on some instinctive level, that a king who would abandon a true bond for political convenience could not be fully trusted to hold firm on anything else. Enough, Cale said, cutting through the tense silence. I want new scouts on the eastern trails by morning, wolves I trust personally, not simply the ones easiest to spare. And I want Rowan brought before me. Where is he? Training the newer recruits, Your Majesty, Edmund answered quickly, clearly relieved for a change of subject. Shall I send for him? Immediately. The council dispersed shortly after, murmuring among themselves as they filed out of the chamber, leaving Cale alone with his thoughts, and the faint smell of spilled wine soaking into the stone floor. He remained standing at the head of the table for a long while, listening to the distant sounds of the fortress around him, the clang of the training yard, the murmur of servants moving through the halls, the wind pressing against the high windows. Rowan arrived within the hour, his familiar footsteps unmistakable even before he spoke. You wanted me, Your Majesty? Sit, Cale said, gesturing vaguely toward the chair across from him. I need someone I trust to handle something delicate, and I cannot rely on the council for this particular matter. Rowan settled into the chair, his tone curious but respectful. He had served as Cale's personal tracker and closest friend since childhood, long before either of them held any formal titles, and unlike most of the council, he had never once treated Cale's blindness as a reason to speak to him differently. The eastern trade routes, Cale said. I want a full accounting of every trader passing through our borders over the last month. Every cart, every good sold, every cent that has crossed into our territory. Rowan hesitated. That is an unusual request. Are you concerned about smuggling? Weapons moving through under the guise of trade goods? Cale considered how to explain it without sounding entirely irrational. Even to his own ears, the truth felt strange. 3 days ago, he said slowly, a caravan passed near the southern gate. I was walking the outer wall, as I often do in the evenings, and the wind carried something toward me. A scent I have not smelled in 5 years, one I was certain I would never smell again. Rowan's voice sharpened with attention. What kind of scent? Cale's jaw tightened, the memory pressing sharply against something old and unhealed in his chest. Moonflower. But not simply moonflower. There is a particular quality to certain scents that only exists when they are tied to a specific person, a resonance that lingers, even through distance and time. I would know this one anywhere. I have spent 5 years trying to forget it, and I still could not mistake it for anything else. You believe it belonged to Lyra, Rowan said quietly, understanding immediately. I do not simply believe it, Cale said. I know it. The bond may have been broken by decree, but something of it clearly remains. Enough that a single scent carried on the wind was enough to stop me cold in the middle of the outer wall. I need to know where that caravan came from, and I need to know if there is any possibility she is still connected to it. Rowan studied his old friend for a long moment, weighing the request carefully. Even if I find the source, Your Majesty, that does not mean pursuing this is wise. You released her formally, before the entire pack. Reopening that matter now could create serious complications, both politically and personally. I am aware of the complications, Cale said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier fury, and left with something rawer underneath. I do not care. For 5 years I have told myself the bond meant nothing anymore, that releasing her was simply the practical decision a king had to make. But a single scent on the wind undid 5 years of careful convincing in the space of a single breath. I need to know if she is well. That is all I am asking for, Rowan. Nothing more, at least not yet. Rowan nodded slowly, recognizing the particular stubbornness in Cale's voice that had never once, in all the years he had known him, backed down from anything it truly wanted. I will find the caravan, Rowan said, and I will discover where the moonflowers came from. But Cale, listen to me carefully. If this leads back to her, You must consider what you intend to do with that knowledge before you act on it. She built a life without you. That life deserves respect, whatever you decide to do next. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his blind eyes fixed on some point beyond the chamber walls, beyond the fortress, somewhere out along the distant trade roads where a single scent had already begun to unravel 5 years of careful, practiced denial. I understand, he said finally. Find her, Rowan. Whatever comes after, I need to know she is safe first. The rest I will figure out once I have that answer. Rowan rose from his chair, offering a final nod before turning toward the door. He paused only once, glancing back at the king, who sat alone in the dim chamber, blind eyes fixed on nothing, and yet somehow, for the first time in longer than Rowan could remember, looking more certain of his own direction than he had in years. I will leave within the hour, Rowan said, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, carrying with them the first thread of a search that would eventually lead straight back to a small garden of pale moonflowers, growing behind an apothecary shop in a quiet town called Ashwell. Rowan spent the better part of 2 weeks tracing the caravan's path, following a trail that led him through 3 separate trading posts before he finally found what he was searching for. The first post, a small crossroads market barely a day's ride from Nightshade territory, gave him nothing useful. The merchants there recognized the description of Henry's cart, but none of them could say for certain where his goods originated. The second post proved more helpful, an older trader mentioning offhand that the Moonflower bundles Henry carried came from somewhere far to the east, beyond packlands entirely, in the neutral territories where humans and shifted folk lived together without pack law. It was at the third post, a bustling river town 2 days further east, that Rowan finally caught up with Henry himself. The old trader was initially wary of Rowan's questions, understandably cautious about a Nightshade wolf, inquiring so specifically about the origin of his goods. But Rowan had learned patience over years of tracking difficult trails, and he approached the conversation carefully, buying a round of drinks at the town's modest tavern and easing into the subject slowly, rather than demanding answers outright. Strange thing, Rowan said, turning his cup idly on the worn wooden table between them. I have smelled a great many rare goods pass through our borders over the years, but nothing quite like those Moonflower bundles you brought through the southern gate last month. My king took particular notice of the scent. Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. The king himself noticed a batch of dried flowers? That is unusual attention for simple trade goods. He has an unusually sensitive sense of smell, Rowan said, which was true enough without revealing the deeper reason behind Cale's interest. Where do those particular flowers come from? I have never encountered their like, anywhere in pack territory. Henry took a long sip of his drink, considering the question. There is a woman in a small town called Ashwell, well beyond the eastern border, who grows the finest moonflowers I have ever come across. Runs the local apothecary shop too. Has for years now, since she took over from the old woman who used to own it. Her garden produces a scent unlike anything I have seen sold anywhere else along the trade routes, which is precisely why I keep buying from her season after season. My customers pay well for it. Rowan kept his expression carefully neutral, though his pulse quickened at the mention of Ashwell, a name he vaguely recognized from old reports about neutral territories bordering the eastern trade roads. Does this woman have a name? Lyra, Henry said easily, apparently seeing no reason to withhold such a simple piece of information. Quiet sort, keeps mostly to herself and her work, though she is well liked in Ashwell. Excellent healer by all accounts. Why do you ask? Is there some concern about her goods? No concern, Rowan said quickly, forcing his voice to remain steady, despite the confirmation settling heavily in his chest. Simple curiosity, that is all. My king appreciates rare and well-made things. I imagine he would be glad to know where such quality originates, should he ever wish to acquire more directly. Henry seemed satisfied with the explanation, and the conversation drifted naturally toward other matters. Trade routes, prices, the usual concerns of a working merchant. Rowan finished his drink, thanked Henry for his time, and left the tavern with the single piece of information he had traveled 2 weeks to find. Lyra was alive. Lyra was well. And Lyra was living openly in a town called Ashwell, close enough to pack territory that a scent from her garden had traveled all the way to the southern gate on nothing more than a favorable wind. Rowan considered, briefly, simply returning to Nightshade with this information, and letting Cale decide what to do with it from a distance. It would have been the safer choice, The choice least likely to disturb whatever careful peace Lyra had built for herself in the years since her rejection. But he also knew his king well enough to understand that Kale would not be satisfied with second-hand information alone. Not about this particular matter. And so, against his better judgment, Rowan made the decision to travel the remaining distance to Ashwell himself, if only to confirm with his own eyes that the life Lyra had built was genuinely safe and stable before he brought any of this information back to the fortress. It took him another 4 days of travel to reach the small river town. Ashwell was smaller than he expected, a modest collection of stone buildings clustered along a gentle curve of water, the kind of place that seemed to exist entirely outside the usual concerns of pack politics and territorial disputes. He found the apothecary shop easily enough, following the directions Henry had casually provided, and he stood across the street from it for a long while, simply observing. The shop looked well maintained, its windows clean, its small front garden neatly tended with a variety of common herbs alongside a few unfamiliar plants Rowan did not recognize. A young woman came and went from the shop several times while he watched, carrying baskets of goods, greeting passers-by with easy familiarity that suggested long acquaintance rather than the guarded distance of someone hiding from a painful past. He did not see Lyra herself that day, though he lingered near the town square long enough to hear her name mentioned twice by local townsfolk, always with obvious warmth and respect. One older woman, purchasing salve from the young assistant, remarked that she did not know what Ashwell would do without their healer, praising Lyra's skill and kindness in the same breath. Rowan felt a complicated mixture of relief and unease settle over him as he made his way toward the small inn, where he intended to spend the night, before beginning his journey back to Nightshade. Relief, because it was clear Lyra had built a genuinely good life for herself here, respected and valued, in a community that had no idea of her painful history. Unease, because he understood exactly what it would mean if he returned to Kale with this confirmation, and exactly how much that revelation threatened to disrupt the peace she had so carefully constructed. He thought about Kale's face in the council chamber, the raw desperation beneath his carefully controlled words, the way 5 years of practiced denial had shattered in an instant at the mere memory of a scent carried on the wind. Whatever Kale intended to do with this information, Rowan knew his old friend well enough to understand that he would not simply let the matter rest now that he had proof Lyra was alive and within reach. That night, lying awake in the small inn room, with the sound of the river drifting through the window, Rowan turned the decision over carefully in his mind. He could return to Nightshade and tell Kale only that Lyra was safe and well established, perhaps convincing him that the matter should be left alone entirely, that reopening old wounds would serve no one well. Or he could tell Kale the full truth, including the exact location of her shop and garden, and trust his king to handle whatever came next with the same careful consideration Kale had always shown, even in his darkest moments, toward the people he genuinely cared about. In the end, Rowan knew there was really only one choice available to him. Kale deserved the truth, however complicated it might prove to unravel. And Lyra, whatever pain the past still carried for her, deserved the chance to face that truth on her own terms, rather than having it hidden from her by well-meaning friends who thought they knew better. He left Ashwell the following morning, carrying with him the single piece of information that would soon bring the King of Nightshade himself, walking through the quiet streets of a town he had never before had reason to visit, drawn there by nothing more than the memory of a scent he had spent 5 long years trying, and failing, to forget. Kale listened to Rowan's report in complete silence, standing at the window of his private chamber with his back to the door, his hands braced against the stone sill, as though he needed something solid to hold on to, while the words settled over him. Ashwell, he repeated quietly, once Rowan had finished. How far is it from here? 6 days by horse, if the weather holds, Rowan said. Longer if it does not. The route passes through neutral territory for most of the journey, which means we will need to travel without pack markings to avoid drawing unwanted attention. I do not care about the journey, Kale said. I need to know if she is truly safe there. Truly settled. Tell me everything you saw. Rowan described what he had observed as thoroughly as he could. The well-kept shop, the respect the townsfolk clearly held for Lyra, the thriving garden behind the apothecary that had apparently become somewhat famous throughout the region for its rare and fragrant blooms. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the awareness that whatever he said next would likely determine what Kale chose to do about all of it. She has built a good life, Rowan said finally. A life entirely separate from the pack, from the bond, from everything that happened 5 years ago. I would not blame her if she wanted it to remain that way. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his blind eyes fixed on the window despite having no way to see whatever lay beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Rowan had not heard from him in years. "Do you remember?" Cale said slowly. "The night before the accident took my sight, I had asked her, that same evening, if she believed our bond would last, regardless of whatever happened between us in the years ahead. She told me that a true bond was not something either of us could break simply through distance or difficulty, that it would remain steady as long as we both chose to honor it." Rowan remained silent, sensing his old friend needed the space to continue without interruption. "I broke that promise," Cale continued, "not because the bond itself failed, but because I allowed fear and political pressure to convince me that breaking it was somehow the stronger choice. I have spent 5 years telling myself I did what was necessary for the pack. I am no longer certain that was ever true." "What do you intend to do?" Rowan asked carefully. Cale turned away from the window at last, facing the general direction of Rowan's voice, with an expression of quiet, resolved determination that Rowan had not seen on his friend's face in a very long time. "I intend to go to Ashwell myself," Cale said, "not to demand anything from her, not to reclaim a bond she may no longer wish to acknowledge, simply to see her, if she will allow it, and to finally offer the apology she deserved 5 years ago, but never received." "The council will object strongly," Rowan warned. "A king traveling personally into neutral territory, particularly for a matter as delicate as this, could be seen as a significant vulnerability, especially with Daniel's raids growing bolder along the eastern borders." "Let them object," Cale said, and for the first time in longer than Rowan could remember, there was no hesitation in his voice, no careful weighing of political consequence before committing to a decision. "I have spent 5 years letting the council's fears dictate my choices, and it has cost me the one steady thing I ever truly had. I will not make that mistake again." Rowan studied his friend for a long moment, recognizing something in Cale's bearing that reminded him powerfully of the young alpha he had known before the accident, before the crown, before 5 years of careful, exhausting compromise had worn down the fire that once defined him. "Then I will make the arrangements," Rowan said. "We leave within 3 days. That should give enough time to prepare a small, discreet escort, nothing that will draw unwanted attention along the route." "Thank you, Rowan," Cale said quietly, "for finding her. For bringing me the truth, even knowing how complicated it might prove to be." "You are my king," Rowan said simply. "But more than that, you are my friend, and I have watched you carry this particular weight, for 5 years, without ever once speaking of it openly, until that scent reached you on the southern wall. Whatever comes of this journey, I am glad you are finally choosing to face it directly, rather than letting it continue to quietly hollow you out." Over the following 3 days, preparations moved forward carefully and quietly. Cale informed only Rowan and a small handful of trusted guards about the true purpose of the journey, allowing the council to believe it was simply a diplomatic matter concerning trade relations along the eastern border, a plausible enough cover that raised no significant alarm. Edmund, predictably, questioned the wisdom of the king traveling personally for what he assumed was routine trade business, suggesting repeatedly that such matters could easily be handled by lesser envoys. Cale simply informed him, with a calm finality that left no room for further argument, that his decision was final, and that the council's role in this particular matter was concluded. The morning of departure arrived clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn air that carried sounds and scents further than usual across open ground. Cale stood at the southern gate, the same wall where the moonflower scent had first reached him weeks earlier, and breathed deeply, searching instinctively for any hint of that same fragrance carried on the current wind, though he knew logically it was far too soon and far too distant a hope. "Ready, Your Majesty?" Rowan asked, bringing his horse alongside Cale's own mount. Cale nodded, settling into the saddle with the practiced ease of a man who had learned, over 5 long years, how to navigate a world he could no longer see through instinct, sound, and unwavering determination alone. "Ready," he confirmed. "Let us go find her, Rowan. Whatever she chooses to say to me once we arrive, at least she will finally hear the truth directly from me, rather than through the cold formality of a broken bond declared before an entire watching pack." The small group set out from Nightshade territory shortly after. 6 days of travel stretching ahead of them across neutral lands neither Kale nor most of his guards had ever before had reason to visit. The journey would prove longer and more difficult than any of them anticipated. But for Kale, every mile covered felt like progress towards something he should have fought for 5 years earlier. A truth he intended to finally set right, regardless of what it might cost him politically, personally, or otherwise. Behind them, in the fortress they left quietly in their wake, Edmund watched the small departing party from a high window, with a deeply troubled expression, already turning over in his mind the various ways this unexpected journey might yet be turned to his advantage, or, depending on how matters unfolded, contained before it could threaten the careful balance of power he and his fellow advisors had spent 5 years building, around a king they privately believed could never again rule with the strength his position demanded. Grace burst through the shop door so quickly that the bell above it rattled violently against the frame. "Lyra, there are strangers asking questions about you in the market," she said, breathless from running. "Wolves, from the look of them, though they wear no pack markings. They have been asking the merchants about the apothecary, about the Moonflower garden, about you, specifically, by name." Lyra set down the mortar and pestle she had been using to grind dried chamomile, her hands suddenly unsteady. "What exactly are they asking?" "Where you came from originally," Grace said. "How long you have lived in Ashwell. Whether you have any connections to pack territory in the west." The words settled over Lyra like ice water, and for a moment she simply stood frozen behind the counter, old fear rising sharply from wherever she had buried it over the past 5 years. "Did they give any names?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Not that I heard," Grace said. "But Lyra, you are frightening me. What is happening? You have never told me exactly where you came from before Ashwell, and I have never pushed you on it, because I assumed you had your reasons. Are you in some kind of danger?" Lyra sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter, pressing her hands against her face for a long moment, before finally answering. She had never told Grace, or anyone in Ashwell, the full truth of her past. It had simply been easier, all these years, to let people assume she had come from an ordinary background, nothing worth discussing in detail. "I came from Nightshade territory," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was bonded once, to a wolf who eventually became their king. The bond was broken, formally, before the entire pack, 5 years ago. I left that same night and never went back." Grace's expression softened with immediate sympathy, though confusion remained clear in her eyes. A broken bond. That explains a great deal, actually, looking back on certain things over the years. "But Lyra, if the bond was broken formally, why would anyone from that pack still be searching for you now, after all this time?" "I do not know," Lyra admitted. "Perhaps it is nothing. Perhaps it is simple trade curiosity about the Moonflower garden. Nothing more. Henry has been selling my flowers along the western routes for years now. It is entirely possible someone in Nightshade territory simply noticed the scent and grew curious about its origin." Even as she said it, though, she did not fully believe her own explanation. A broken bond was supposed to sever every meaningful connection between two people, at least in theory. But some part of her, deep and instinctive, had always wondered if something of that connection lingered regardless, some faint thread neither declaration nor distance could fully erase. "What do you want to do?" Grace asked gently. "If you believe this could be dangerous, we can close the shop for a few days. You could stay with my family until whoever these strangers are moves on." Lyra considered the offer for a long moment, old instincts warring visibly with the steady, settled life she had built here. Running had once been her only option, back when she left Nightshade with nothing but a small bag and Sable's borrowed coins. But Ashwell was different. Ashwell was hers, built with her own hands over 5 patient years, and the thought of abandoning it, even temporarily, out of old fear, felt like surrendering something she had fought hard to earn. "No," she said finally, straightening on the stool with renewed resolve. "I will not hide. Whatever these strangers want, I built this life honestly, and I will not abandon it out of fear over something that happened 5 years ago in a place I no longer belong to." Grace nodded, though worry remained evident in her expression. "Then at least let me stay close by for the next few days, just in case." Lyra agreed, grateful for her friend's steady presence, and the two women spent the remainder of that day working through the shop's usual business, with an underlying tension neither of them could fully shake. Every customer who entered drew a flicker of wary attention from Lyra, every unfamiliar face examined carefully before she allowed herself to relax back into routine. That evening, after closing the shop, Lyra walked out to her garden as she always did, though her usual sense of peace felt harder to reach than normal. She knelt among the moonflowers, breathing in their familiar scent, trying to steady the anxious thoughts still circling through her mind. Sable had written to her occasionally over the years, brief letters carried through trusted intermediaries, keeping her loosely informed about developments within Nightshade territory, without ever risking direct contact that might draw unwanted attention. Through those letters, Lyra had learned, in fragments, about the pack's growing troubles, the increasingly bold raids from a rival alpha named Daniel, the mounting pressure on Kale's rule from advisors who had never fully accepted a blind king as sufficiently strong. She had told herself, reading those letters, that she felt nothing beyond distant, professional concern for a pack she no longer belonged to. But sitting now among her moonflowers, her heart still racing faintly from the day's unexpected fear, she could no longer fully convince herself of that particular lie. If wolves from Nightshade were truly searching for her, there was only one reason significant enough to justify such an effort after 5 long years of silence, and the thought of what that reason might mean, of Kale himself somehow reaching across the years and the broken bond to find her again, sent a confusing tangle of emotions through her chest that she was entirely unprepared to examine closely. She thought about the anger she still carried, the memory of standing before the entire pack, while the one person who should have fought for her instead released her with careful, formal words in front of everyone she knew. She thought about the years of rebuilding that had followed, the quiet pride of everything she had accomplished entirely on her own terms, without any reliance on pack politics or royal titles. And beneath all of that, buried deeper than she wanted to admit even to herself, she thought about the particular way Kale's hand had felt closing around hers on the night their bond first activated, and wondered, despite everything, whether some faint part of that connection had truly survived 5 years of careful, deliberate distance. "Whatever happens," she said quietly to the moonflowers surrounding her, as though speaking the words aloud might somehow steady her resolve, "I will not let fear decide this for me again. Not this time." The moon rose higher above the garden, and the pale blossoms around her opened fully in response, releasing their familiar, calming scent into the cool evening air. Lyra remained there a long while, gathering her strength for whatever might arrive on Ashwell's quiet streets in the days ahead, though she could not yet know just how soon that arrival would come, or how completely it would challenge everything she had carefully convinced herself she had left behind for good. The bell above the shop door rang just as the afternoon light began to slant low through the front windows, and Lyra glanced up from the counter expecting another regular customer. Instead, she found herself looking directly at Rowan. She recognized him instantly, despite the years that had passed. He had been present at the rejection ceremony, standing near the edge of the hall, one of the few faces in that terrible crowd who had looked genuinely uncomfortable with what was unfolding. Seeing him now, standing in the doorway of her own shop in Ashwell, sent a sharp jolt of alarm straight through her chest. "Lyra," Rowan said quietly, his tone careful, clearly aware of how unwelcome his sudden appearance likely felt. "I did not come here to cause trouble. I only wish to speak with you, if you are willing." "Why are you here?" Lyra asked, her voice tight with controlled tension, one hand resting instinctively near the small knife she kept beneath the counter for emergencies, though she doubted seriously she would ever need it against someone like Rowan. "There is something you deserve to know," Rowan said, "something I believe you would want to hear directly, rather than through rumor or second-hand report." Before Lyra could respond, the bell above the door rang again, and this time, the figure stepping through the frame stopped her breath entirely. Kale stood in the doorway, his familiar blind eyes searching the space with the same careful, deliberate movement she remembered from years earlier, his expression tense with an emotion she could not immediately name. He looked older than she remembered, lines of exhaustion carved more deeply into his face. But the moment he stepped fully inside the shop, his head turned sharply, unerringly, directly toward where she stood behind the counter, as though some invisible thread had pulled his attention straight to her, without any need for sight at all. "Lyra," he said, and her name in his voice, unchanged despite 5 years and everything that had happened between them, undid something. carefully guarded deep in her chest. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rowan quietly stepped back toward the door, giving them what space the small shop allowed, though he remained close enough to intervene should the situation require it. "You should not be here," Lyra finally managed, her voice shaking despite her best effort to keep it steady. "You released me, Kale, before the entire pack. Whatever brought you all this way, it does not change what happened that night." "I know," Kale said, his voice rough with an emotion that sounded almost like grief. "I know exactly what I did, and I have thought about it every single day since. I did not come here to undo the past or demand anything from you. I came because I owe you an apology I should have given you 5 years ago, and because I could not continue living without at least trying to offer it directly." Lyra's hands trembled against the counter's edge. 5 years of carefully built distance suddenly felt impossibly thin, worn away in an instant by nothing more than the sound of his voice and the unmistakable way his blind eyes had found her the moment he stepped through the door. "How did you even find me?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "Your moonflowers," Kale said quietly. "A trader carried some through the southern gate weeks ago. The wind caught the scent, and I knew it instantly, even after all this time. I sent Rowan to find its source. I never expected the search would lead somewhere so far, or that you would have built such a full life for yourself here." Lyra felt tears gathering despite her fierce determination not to let them fall in front of him. "You broke the bond, Kale. You stood before everyone and released me, and then you let me walk out of that hall alone, with nothing, while your advisors nodded along in obvious relief." "I was wrong," Kale said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the admission. "I let fear and pressure convince me that releasing you would somehow prove my strength as king. It proved nothing, except my own weakness in that moment. I have watched the pack grow weaker in the years since, not stronger, and I have come to understand, far too late, that the thing I thought would make me appear more capable instead cost me the one steady presence that ever truly helped me face this blindness, without losing myself entirely." Lyra wiped angrily at the tears now falling despite her best effort. "Do you understand what those 5 years were like for me? I left with nothing, no pack, no title, no bond, nothing except the clothes on my back, and whatever coins Sable could spare. I had to build an entire life from scratch, in a place where no one knew me, terrified the whole time that someone from Nightshade might eventually find me, and drag me back into a world that had already made very clear how little it valued me." "I know," Kale said again, and this time his voice broke completely. "I know, and I am not asking you to forgive me, simply because I have finally arrived here to say the words I should have said 5 years ago. I am not asking you to return to Nightshade, or to reopen a bond you may no longer want any part of. I only needed you to hear the truth directly from me, after everything, because you deserved that much, at the very least, 5 years ago, and you deserve it now." The shop fell silent, except for the faint sound of Grace, shifting uncomfortably near the backroom doorway, clearly having overheard enough of the conversation to understand its significance, though she remained wisely quiet, not wanting to intrude on a moment so clearly private, despite unfolding in a fairly public space. Lyra studied Kale for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion etched into his face, the careful, searching way his blind eyes moved, as though still trying, 5 years later, to somehow find her fully, despite the darkness that had taken his sight. Anger and old grief warred fiercely within her chest, alongside something else, something she had spent 5 years refusing to name, a faint warmth she recognized with sudden, unwelcome clarity, as the ghost of a bond that perhaps had never been as fully severed as the formal declaration in that hall had claimed. "I do not know what I want from this," she said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier sharp edge. "I built a life here, Kale, a good one. I am not the same frightened woman who left Nightshade 5 years ago, with nothing but a bag of clothes and a broken heart." "I can see that clearly," Kale said, and despite everything, a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Even without my sight, I can hear it in your voice, in the steadiness of how you speak, in the confidence of this shop you have built. Whatever life you have made here, Lyra, it is clearly a good one, and I have no wish to disrupt it simply by arriving unannounced with an apology 5 years too late." "Then why did you come?" she asked, though the question carried less hostility now than it had moments earlier. "Because I needed you to know the truth," Kale said simply. "Beyond that, I am asking for nothing except whatever time you might be willing to give me, to prove through action, rather than empty words, that I understand exactly how badly I failed you, and that I am prepared to earn back even a fraction of the trust I so carelessly threw away." Lyra remained silent for a long moment, the weight of 5 years pressing heavily against her chest, old wounds resurfacing alongside a fragile, unexpected flicker of something she had thought long dead. Outside, the late afternoon light continued its slow slant across Ashwell's quiet streets, entirely unaware of the quiet, monumental collision unfolding within the walls of the small apothecary shop, where a broken bond and 5 years of careful distance had just, however cautiously, begun to unravel back toward each other once more. Word of Cale's arrival spread through Ashwell quickly, though most townsfolk had no understanding of the full history behind the quiet, dignified stranger who now visited the apothecary shop each afternoon, always polite, always careful, never once overstaying his welcome. Lyra had not yet asked him to leave permanently, though she had made clear during that first difficult conversation that she needed time before she could decide what, if anything, she wanted from his sudden return into her life. Cale had accepted this without argument, taking a room at the small inn near the town square and settling into a routine that seemed designed entirely around demonstrating patience rather than pressing for anything more than she was willing to offer. "He asked me yesterday about the proper way to harvest lavender," Grace said one morning, arranging fresh stock along the shop's front shelves, while Lyra ground herbs at the counter. "Spent nearly an hour listening carefully, as I explained which stems to cut and how to bundle them for drying. He seemed genuinely interested, not simply making conversation to pass the time." Lyra did not look up from her work, though she felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest at the description. He always did have a habit of committing himself fully to whatever task was in front of him, even things that seemed unimportant to everyone else. "You still care for him," Grace observed gently, not unkindly. "I can hear it in how you speak about him, even now." "Caring for someone and trusting them again are very different things," Lyra said, though she did not deny the underlying truth of Grace's observation. "He hurt me badly, Grace. An apology, however sincere, does not simply erase 5 years of rebuilding my life from nothing." "No one is asking you to pretend it does," Grace said. "But perhaps it is worth noticing that he has not once asked you to pretend it does either. He has not pressured you to return to Nightshade. He has not demanded the bond be restored. He has simply shown up, day after day, patient and steady, willing to learn about your life exactly as it is now, rather than expecting you to fold back into the life you left behind." Lyra considered this quietly, continuing her work without immediate response, though Grace's words settled deeply into thoughts she had been turning over privately for days already. Over the following 2 weeks, Cale's presence in Ashwell became a steady, familiar rhythm. He visited the shop most afternoons, sometimes helping Grace with simple tasks around the counter, other times simply sitting quietly nearby, while Lyra worked, content to listen to the ordinary sounds of her daily life, without demanding her direct attention. He learned the names of her regular customers, remembering each one after only a single introduction, a skill Lyra suspected he had cultivated deliberately over his years of blindness, relying on memory and careful attention in place of the visual recognition most people took entirely for granted. He learned the layout of the shop well enough to navigate it confidently without assistance, memorizing the position of shelves and counters after only a few visits. Most surprising to Lyra was his genuine interest in the Moonflower garden itself. He asked detailed questions about its history, about the old story Margaret had once shared regarding the flower's rare blooming pattern, about the particular care the plants required to thrive as fully as they did behind her shop. "May I see it?" he asked one evening, as Lyra prepared to close the shop for the day. "I understand, of course, that I cannot see it in the way others might, but I would like to experience it, if you are willing to show me." Lyra hesitated only briefly before agreeing, leading him carefully through the back door and out into the small garden behind the apothecary. The evening air carried the familiar pale sweetness of the moonflowers as they began their nightly bloom, and she watched Cale's expression shift into something close to wonder as the scent reached him fully. "This is remarkable," he said quietly, kneeling carefully among the rows of tall stems, his hands reaching out gently to feel the delicate petals without crushing them. "I understand now why the scent carried so far. There is something almost alive about it, beyond simple fragrance. Margaret told me once that moonflowers bloom fully, Only for someone strong enough to grow something beautiful out of significant loss, Lyra said quietly, kneeling beside him among the flowers. I did not fully believe the story when she first told it to me. I am not certain I fully believe it even now. But there have been nights, standing here alone, when I have wondered if perhaps there is some truth buried within it. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his sightless eyes turned toward her despite having no way to see her face. If that story carries any truth at all, he said softly, then I imagine you are exactly the kind of person it describes. You took the worst moment of your life, a moment I caused, and grew something remarkable out of it entirely on your own. I do not believe I could have managed anything close to that same strength, had our positions been reversed. You have managed a great deal these past 5 years, Lyra said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice. Ruling a pack while blind, facing down a council determined to convince you of your own weakness, holding together a kingdom under constant threat from Daniel's raids. That takes its own kind of strength, Cale, whatever mistakes came alongside it. They remained in the garden together a long while that evening, speaking quietly about the years that had passed, about Cale's continuing struggles with the council, about the small, steady triumphs of the life Lyra had built in Ashwell. For the first time since his arrival, the conversation felt less like careful negotiation between two wounded people, and more like the easy, familiar exchange they had once shared, before everything fell apart. I am not offering you a return to how things were, Cale said eventually, as the evening grew late, and the Moonflower's scent deepened around them. I understand that such a thing may no longer even be possible, given everything that has happened. I am only asking for the chance to continue earning whatever trust you might eventually be willing to extend, on whatever terms you decide are fair. Lyra studied him quietly in the pale moonlight, this blind king, who had traveled 6 difficult days to deliver an apology 5 years overdue, who had spent 2 patient weeks learning the shape of her new life without once demanding she abandon it for his sake. I am willing to keep talking, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty still lingering beneath it. That is all I can offer for now, Cale. Nothing more, at least not yet. That is more than I dared hope for when I first arrived, Cale said, and the quiet relief in his voice carried a sincerity that reached something deep and long guarded within her chest. Above them, the moon continued its steady climb across the clear night sky, illuminating the garden's pale blossoms in soft silver light, bearing quiet witness to 2 people who had once shared everything, lost it entirely through fear and pressure, and were now, slowly and carefully, beginning to find their way back toward whatever new understanding might yet be possible between them. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his voice hoarse from 3 days of hard riding. Rowan intercepted him at the edge of town, recognizing the pack markings on the exhausted rider's cloak immediately. What news? He demanded, already sensing from the man's expression that whatever he carried was not good. Daniel's forces have breached the eastern border, the messenger gasped out, accepting the water Rowan offered before continuing. 2 villages burned already. Edmund has rallied what defense he can, but without the king present, the wolves are frightened, uncertain. Morale is failing badly. We need him back immediately, or Nightshade risks losing the entire eastern territory before winter arrives. Rowan's stomach tightened with dread. He found Cale within minutes, delivering the news as steadily as he could manage, though the weight of it was impossible to soften. Cale's expression hardened the moment he understood the full scope of what was happening. How long ago did the breach occur? 4 days, Your Majesty, the messenger said. The situation may have worsened considerably since I departed. Then we ride within the hour, Cale said, already moving toward the inn to gather his things. He found Lyra at the shop shortly after, her expression shifting from surprise to concern, the moment she saw the urgency written plainly across his face. What has happened? She asked immediately. Daniel's forces have breached the eastern border, Cale said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. Villages burned, the pack's defense faltering without me present. I must return immediately, Lyra. I do not know how this will resolve, or what condition I might find the kingdom in by the time I arrive. Lyra felt her heart clench painfully at the news. Old instinctive concern for the pack she had once called home, rising sharply alongside newer, more complicated feelings for the man now standing before her, his blind eyes carrying an unmistakable weight of fear and responsibility. Go, she said immediately. Your people need you, Kale. Whatever remains unresolved between us can wait until this crisis is handled. Kale hesitated at the doorway, clearly torn between the urgent need to depart and something else he seemed reluctant to leave unsaid. I do not know what condition I will return in, if I am able to return at all. Daniel's forces have grown considerably stronger these past years, and without full sight, I remain at a genuine disadvantage in direct combat, regardless of how thoroughly I have trained to compensate. Lyra crossed the shop quickly, closing the distance between them, and took his hands firmly in her own. You are not the same blind alpha your council has spent 5 years convincing you that you are, Kale. You have led through crisis before. You will find a way to lead through this one as well. Come with me, Kale said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise even himself as they left his mouth. Not as my Omega, not to reclaim any bond, simply as a healer. Nightshade will need every skilled hand available if this conflict escalates further, and I know of no healer more capable than you. Lyra's breath caught sharply at the unexpected request. Every old fear about returning to Nightshade territory rose immediately to the surface, alongside a fierce, unexpected pull toward doing exactly as he asked. I have a shop here, she said slowly. A life I built entirely on my own. I know, Kale said. I am not asking you to give any of that up permanently. I am asking for your help during a genuine crisis, nothing more. Whatever happens between us afterward remains entirely your choice, exactly as it has been these past weeks. Lyra looked toward Grace, who had been listening quietly from near the back room, her expression carrying clear understanding of the weight behind this particular decision. Go, Grace said simply. I can manage the shop for however long you need. Ashwell will still be here when you return, Lyra. But if Nightshade needs your skill, and you are willing to give it, then go. Lyra turned back to Kale, her decision settling firmly despite the fear still tangled beneath it. I will come. Give me an hour to gather my supplies. Within that same hour, Lyra packed every useful remedy her shop contained. Salves for burns, herbs for fever, tinctures for pain, everything she suspected a war-torn territory might desperately require in the days ahead. She left detailed instructions with Grace regarding the garden's care, embraced her friend tightly at the door, and mounted the horse Rowan had arranged for her without further hesitation. The journey back to Nightshade territory passed in a tense blur, the small party pushing their horses harder than the outward journey had required, urgency driving every mile forward. Kale remained largely silent throughout the ride, his jaw set with grim determination, clearly turning over strategy and preparation in his mind, despite the physical exhaustion of hard travel. They arrived at the fortress on the evening of the 4th day, greeted immediately by Edmund's visibly relieved but deeply strained expression. Your Majesty, thank the moon you have returned, Edmund said, barely sparing Lyra a glance before continuing. The eastern villages have fallen entirely. Daniel's forces continue pressing westward. Our defenses are stretched thin, and morale among the younger wolves has weakened considerably in your absence. Gather the council and the senior wolves in the main hall within the hour, Kale said, his voice carrying an authority Rowan had not heard from him in years. I want a full accounting of our current positions, our remaining strength, and Daniel's likely next movements. Edmund hesitated, his eyes flicking uncertainly toward Lyra. Your Majesty, is it wise to bring the Omega back into the fortress at a time of such delicate crisis? Her presence could raise complicated questions among the council regarding. Lyra is here as a healer, Kale cut in sharply, his tone leaving no room for further argument. Her skill will save lives in the days ahead, and that is the only consideration that matters right now. Gather the council, Edmund. We have no time to waste on old politics while our people are dying along the eastern border. Edmund departed quickly, clearly recognizing the futility of further objection, and within the hour, the main hall filled once more with anxious faces, though this time, Kale stood at its head with a renewed clarity and resolve that seemed to steady the room's uncertain energy almost immediately. He listened carefully to every report, asking sharp, precise questions that revealed a strategic mind clearly unaffected by his years of blindness, drawing on instinct, memory, and the trusted counsel of Rowan and his most loyal captains to assemble a defensive plan far more decisive than anything the council had managed to organize during his absence. Lyra watched from the edge of the hall, quietly setting up a makeshift healing station in an adjoining chamber, preparing for the wounded she suspected would soon arrive in significant numbers. She felt the old, familiar rhythm of the fortress settling around her once more. 5 years of distance falling away as instinct and training took hold, guiding her hands through preparations she had once known intimately during her earlier years bonded to Kale. Over the following days, the battle for the eastern border intensified sharply. Kale rode out personally with his strongest wolves, trusting Rowan's guidance and his own honed instincts to compensate for the sight he had lost, fighting with a fierce, focused determination that steadily began turning the tide against Daniel's overextended forces. Lyra, meanwhile, worked tirelessly in the healing chambers, treating a steady stream of wounded wolves brought back from the front lines, her skill and calm presence earning quiet gratitude from soldiers who had no idea of her earlier history within these very walls. On the 5th night since their return, as Lyra changed the dressing on a young soldier's wounded arm, Rowan appeared in the doorway, his expression carrying news she could not immediately read. "Kale has been injured," he said quietly. "Not severely, but he refuses to leave the field until Daniel's forces are fully pushed back. He is asking for you specifically, Lyra. Says no other healer's hands will do." Lyra's heart lurched sharply, old fear and newer, undeniable care colliding fiercely within her chest as she gathered her supplies immediately and followed Rowan out toward the fortress gates, toward whatever condition she might find the blind king of Nightshade in this critical moment, and toward whatever final choice this ongoing crisis might yet force her to finally, fully make. She found Kale propped against a supply crate at the edge of the eastern camp, a deep gash along his shoulder, wrapped hastily in cloth already darkening with blood. Despite the wound, his expression remained sharp and alert, his attention turning immediately toward her the moment she approached, exactly as it always had, unerring and certain despite the darkness that had taken his sight years earlier. "You should not have insisted on staying out here," Lyra said, kneeling beside him and immediately unwrapping the makeshift bandage to examine the wound properly. "This needed proper treatment hours ago." "I could not leave until I was certain the eastern line would hold," Kale said, wincing slightly as she cleaned the injury with practiced efficiency. "Daniel's forces are retreating now. Rowan confirms it. We have pushed them back beyond the border entirely." "That is good news," Lyra said, focusing on her work, applying a healing salve she had prepared specifically for deep wounds before carefully rebandaging his shoulder. "But it does not excuse you risking further injury by refusing treatment for hours while a battle raged around you." "I trusted you would come the moment I asked," Kale said quietly, and something in his tone carried a weight beyond simple explanation of his stubbornness. "Just as I have trusted, these past weeks, that whatever remains broken between us might yet find its way back toward something whole, given enough patience and honest effort." Lyra paused in her work, looking up at his face in the flickering light of the nearby campfires. The battle's noise had faded into the distance, replaced by the quieter sounds of a camp settling into the aftermath of hard-fought victory, wounded soldiers being tended, exhausted wolves resting where they could find space. "You fought well," she said softly. "Rowan told me you led the defense personally, that your strategy turned the entire battle in our favor, despite Daniel's forces having the early advantage." "I fought as well as I could," Kale said. "But Lyra, I want you to understand something clearly, now that the immediate crisis has passed. I did not ask you to return to Nightshade, simply because I needed a skilled healer, though that was certainly true. I asked because some part of me has known, since the moment that Moonflower scent first reached me on the southern wall, that I could not continue building any version of my future without at least trying to include you in it, on whatever terms you might eventually be willing to accept." Lyra set aside her supplies, studying him carefully in the firelight. 5 years of careful distance, of rebuilding a life entirely her own, of anger and grief and slow, quiet healing, all of it seemed to gather now into this single decisive moment. "I am not the same woman who left this fortress 5 years ago," she said finally. "I built something entirely my own in Ashwell, something I am deeply proud of, and I will not simply set it aside to become only your Omega once more, defined entirely by a bond and a crown." "I would never ask that of you," Kale said immediately, his voice earnest and unwavering. "Whatever future we might build together, it would need to include everything you have become these past 5 years, not erase it. Your garden, your shop, your skill as a healer, all of it. I have watched these past weeks how much strength and purpose that life has given you, and I would never wish to diminish any part of it. Then what exactly are you asking for? Lyra said, though her voice had softened considerably from its earlier guarded edge. Cale reached for her hand, his grip steady despite his injury, and Lyra allowed the contact, feeling something warm and familiar settle between them at the simple touch, a faint echo of the bond that had once connected them so completely. I am asking if you would consider allowing the bond to reform, he said quietly. Not through any formal ceremony forced by council pressure or political convenience, but through your own genuine choice, freely given, exactly as it should have remained all those years ago before fear convinced me otherwise. And I am asking if, alongside that bond, you might consider standing beside me not simply as my Omega, but as Queen, with full voice and authority in how this pack moves forward from here. Lyra felt tears gathering, though this time they carried none of the old grief from 5 years earlier, only the overwhelming weight of a moment she had never quite allowed herself to imagine might actually arrive. The council will not accept that easily, she said, though there was no real objection in her tone, only practical acknowledgement of the challenge ahead. The council will accept whatever proves necessary for this pack's continued strength, Cale said firmly. And after everything that has happened these past weeks, after watching you tend to wounded wolves with the same skill and dedication you clearly bring to everything you do, I do not believe even Edmund will find much room left for argument. Lyra laughed softly, despite the tears still gathering, an unexpected lightness breaking through the tension of the past difficult days. You truly intend to make me queen, Cale, after everything that happened between us. I intend to correct the single greatest mistake of my life, Cale said, his voice carrying quiet, unwavering certainty. And I intend to spend whatever years remain to me, proving, through consistent action rather than empty words, that you were always the steadiest, strongest part of everything I have ever managed to build, long before either of us wore any crown at all. Lyra leaned forward slowly, resting her forehead gently against his, feeling the faint, familiar warmth of the bond, stirring quietly back to life between them, chosen this time freely, without pressure or fear, exactly as it had always deserved to be. Yes, she said softly, I choose this, Cale, not because fate or an old bond demands it, but because I choose you, exactly as you are now, and exactly as I have become these past 5 years. The bond reformed quietly between them that night, without ceremony or witnessing crowd, carried instead on nothing more than 2 honest voices finally speaking truth to each other, beneath a sky full of stars neither of them needed to see clearly, in order to feel its full weight settling gently into place. In the weeks that followed, as Nightshade slowly rebuilt from the conflict along its eastern border, Lyra divided her time carefully between her responsibilities within the fortress and regular visits back to Ashwell, where Grace continued managing the apothecary shop with growing skill and confidence, and where the Moonflower garden continued its quiet, remarkable bloom, its scent now carrying a story far richer than anyone in that small river town could have ever guessed from a simple cluster of pale silver flowers. Edmund, true to Cale's prediction, offered little sustained objection once the council witnessed firsthand how thoroughly Lyra's return had steadied both the pack's morale and the king's own renewed confidence and clarity of leadership. The formal ceremony recognizing her as queen took place on a clear autumn evening, held not within the imposing stone walls of the Nightshade Hall, but instead in an open courtyard beneath the rising moon, surrounded by moonflowers Lyra had personally transplanted from her Ashwell garden for the occasion. As Cale stood beside her that evening, his blind eyes turned toward her with the same unerring certainty that had first led him across 6 difficult days of travel to find her, Lyra breathed in the familiar pale scent surrounding them both and understood, finally and completely, that some bonds, however deeply broken, could indeed find their way back to wholeness, provided both people involved were willing to choose each other honestly, patiently, and without the fear that had once nearly cost them everything. The moonflowers bloomed fully that night, their rare and remarkable fragrance carrying out across the fortress walls and beyond, into the wide world, where a single scent had once traveled far enough to reunite a blind king with the Omega he never should have let go, and where that same scent now marked the beginning of a partnership built, at last, on nothing but honest, freely chosen love.